First off, I just want to say thank you very much for inviting the PDAC here to provide some of our thoughts with respect to what's happening in the mineral industry today. And I personally see, well, at least 2 decades of real excitement ahead of us, so this is great. It was really great to hear the Minister talk about some of the work that the government here is doing with respect to northern infrastructure and talking to the metal demand that the globe needs here to really move us to this lower carbon environment. I don't want to disappoint people, but Scott just told me he flew a long way to hear me speak here today, and unfortunately he's likely not going to hear anything he doesn't know, but I think hopefully I will provide a little bit of insight here in terms of what's happening in the industry. So as you heard, my name is Alex Christopher, and I'm the President of the Prospectors and Developers Association of Canada, better known as either the PDAC or PDAC. That's my volunteer job. My day job, I'm a Senior Vice President at Tech Resources. So I just want to, before I start, I also want to respectfully acknowledge that we're situated on the traditional territories of the Tonquichan and Kwanlindon First Nation. And I'm assuming that essentially everyone here is really familiar with the PDAC and our annual convention that's held every March. So anybody here not familiar with the PDAC convention? Good. However, most of you probably aren't aware of everything the PDAC does beyond our convention, or that the convention really is only a small portion of what the PDAC does every year. So our primary focus really is to work on behalf of more than 6,000 corporate and individual members to promote a responsible, vibrant, and sustainable Canadian mineral exploration and development sector that operates responsibly around the world to find the minerals and metals that are essential to modern life. The PDAC encourages leading practices in technical, environmental, safety, and social performance in Canada and abroad. And we advocate with governments right here in Canada to ensure exploration and development has a voice in shaping the ever-changing regulatory framework, and that government policy supports the access to land, access to capital, and access to people that we require to maintain a healthy, sustainable, and competitive Canadian minerals industry. There we go. Now, as much as ever before, we're facing a critical time for the Canadian minerals industry, and I see a very challenging but very exciting decade or two ahead of us. But to be successful, and as the Minister said, we must continuously work together with governments, First Nations, partners, and other stakeholders to ensure the challenges that we face every day are being heard, and that we continually highlight the important role mineral exploration and mining has in the prosperity of our great country. Our nation is blessed with an abundance of natural resources that are envied the world over, but we still face significant challenges. Despite the enormous potential that exists in Canada's northern regions, hundreds of known mineral deposits remain undeveloped in our 3 territories. And something I'm sure you all know, research shows that exploration in remote regions of Canada it's easily 2, 3, or even 10 times greater than less remote areas. So without that significant infrastructure development to reduce those operating costs, remote communities are not going to be able to benefit from the economic opportunities generated by the industry. So there's really never been a better time to act. Society and the world is looking to transition to low-emission green technologies. Critical minerals and metals for things like batteries and electric vehicles have become the focus of government and industry alike. Canada's north is well positioned to benefit from the change in direction here, and we want to see these opportunities realized. So that's a big challenge. And that's why PDAC works on behalf of its members to support a competitive and responsible Canadian mineral sector where companies are able to effectively explore for, discover, and develop the mineral and metal deposits that our modern society depends on, and we need to be able to do that in a timely fashion. So this past year was characterized by the continued push by both industry at large and our own federal government towards transitioning to this cleaner energy. And this has resulted in increased capital investment directed towards projects involving those critical metals, as well as enhanced funding initiatives such as the extended tax benefit programs for critical minerals development across Canada. And these are things that PDAC advocates strongly for, both from a financial and an environmental stewardship point of view. So in order to support our members and prioritize our advocacy work, PDAC tracks industry data and issues very, very closely. And we do this to make sure our views and the voice we bring to government meshes with the realities of our members to help steer advocacy by targeting our recommendations to government. Over the last few years, we've been a key stakeholder in the development of the Canadian Minerals and Metals Plan and Canada's Critical Minerals List. And we continuously are active, consulting and meeting with parliamentarians and government representatives across the country to ensure the issues faced by our members and industry are well understood. Fiscal incentives, such as the Critical Minerals Exploration Tax Credit, is being implemented now, and we're working to see that the $400 million commitment over the next 5 years dovetails with the currently available incentives and is readily accessible to junior exploration companies. And this is something I'll expand on in a little bit. We responded to the recent consultation on NI 43-101, noting to the regulators that it's imperative the framework remains within the technical realm, and that there needs to be greater alignment between the professional geoscience associations in defining who can be a qualified person in Canada. We're also advocating for increased federal support for the National Benefit Sharing Framework for Natural Resource Project that directly contributes to increased education, training, and capacity development opportunities for Indigenous people in Canada. And at a high level, we consistently engage across government ministries calling for better coordination between federal departments like finance, natural resources, and environment, promoting a cohesive strategy with respect to reaching net zero, conserving our lands and oceans, and building our capacity to supply critical metals required to underpin the transition to a lower carbon future. And while PDAC's primary role is advocating on behalf of industry to the federal government, we do work with regional associations and cohorts to amplify the voice of our members at the provincial and territorial level. PDAC continues to support the Yukon Chamber of Mines, as well as the chambers in the Northwest Territories and Nunavut, in their calls to the federal government to establish a North of 60 mineral exploration tax credit. And this credit could help incentivize more investment into the territories and help offset some of the significant cost disparities I mentioned earlier that are faced by explorers and developers working in areas with limited or no communication, energy, or transportation infrastructure. And we have echoed the Yukon Chamber of Mines' request for more engagement between the Yukon government, industry, and land use planning commissions in considering how to balance conservation and development in setting regional plans in place. We aim to see federal support directed towards geoscience mapping and modeling expanded, particularly for the territories. And we see this information as an essential piece to prioritize development and conservation decisions in the near term and ensure we protect both the biodiversity and industry access to prospective lands. There's no global energy transition without minerals, and Canada can be a supplier of choice for both our own economy and those of our strategic partners, or we can sit on the sidelines. With this generational challenge in front of us, governments must be proactive to make informed decisions about where to prioritize support, including a workable permitting framework for exploration and development. Otherwise, we put all of our overarching sustainability goals at risk. So I'm confident that we're going to continue to see our industry lead the way by making the most of Canada's mineral endowment to provide the building blocks we need for a cleaner future. So before I go on to the rest of my presentation, which is going to focus really on financing, I wanted to take a moment to really kind of walk through the obvious here. You know, number one, climate change is a significant driver in everything we do. Society and governments recognize the issues and have set really lofty goals. I think we're all aware of those. We know that mineral and metals are key components of us reaching those goals. And 2050 is really just around the corner. Unfortunately, historically, it's taken 15 years or longer from discovery to production for a new mine. And this is actually getting slower. But we need to go much faster if we're to deliver into the future vision of the world. So everyone needs to be committed to solving this dilemma if we want to create a better world for future generations. So now over the rest of my presentation, I'm going to take you through some of the recent trends in metal prices and then tie those back to the financial markets and exploration activity to really give us a sense of where the mineral exploration industry landscape in Canada is going. I'm going to also try and connect some of these trends with PDAC's recent advocacy work and what they may mean for explorers in Canada. So switching now, ready to look at some of this data. This outline shows some relative performance of various metals over the last 5 years. The chart on the left really compares copper, zinc, and gold. And we can see relatively low volatility over the 5-year period, with these metals really following an upward trend generally. However, this trend has changed direction in 2022, with the prices for all of these three metals losing ground during the year. Gold's been on a downward trend this year, despite the prospect of widespread inflation and negative real interest rates, which are really typically price catalysts for gold. But it seems like the relative strength of the U.S. economy and their dollar versus other global benchmarks has been the major headwind for gold through most of 2022. That said, I think we've actually seen some rebound in the recent weeks post U.S. midterm elections. The chart on the right here shows a relative price performance for battery metals, nickel, lithium, and cobalt. And unlike the left-hand chart, prices for these three metals have really seen some significant volatility and some real increase in prices over the last few years. The price of nickel has remained in positive territory for the bulk of these 5 years and has effectively doubled over this period of time, with a big sharp uptick in earlier this year, which is quite noticeable. And this is possibly a reflection of the Russian invasion of Ukraine and really some of the concerns around the global supply chain constraints, given that about 15% of the annual nickel production comes from Russia. Lithium and cobalt prices have actually trended fairly flat over this period of time, until 2021, where we see the trajectory of these two metals start to take different directions. Lithium is very strong, whereas cobalt's gone up and down here. And I think cobalt price is still lower right now than it was in 2017, and this is possibly a function of some of the major manufacturers such as Samsung and Tesla announcing a move towards cobalt-free batteries in the future. So basically, in terms of metal prices, just a quick recap here. Lithium outlook really looks strong. Noticeable that the key electric vehicle metals are not necessarily moving in step, with copper, nickel, and cobalt losing some ground in comparison to lithium. And while there's a wealth of inflationary pressures on hand and economic uncertainty on the horizon, the relatively strong US dollar through most of 2022 has held back gold and precious metal demand. So the economic and market demand uncertainties have been weighing heavily on base metal prices during the year. Now that said, the world is waking up to what we need to transition to a net zero or low emission future, and the demand outlook for critical minerals is likely only to grow over the long term. And we can see that in quite often the metal stocks that are out there. There are things like copper at all-time lows in terms of metal stock, although the price has been weakening. So generally, all of these things should bode well for metal prices for more traditional base metals over the near term, as well as the rare earth elements and battery metals. So in general, the global supply-demand balance and trajectory of minerals and metal prices have a heavy influence on what the investment landscape for mineral exploration and development industry looks like, both globally and in Canada. So with those commodity price trends that we just touched on as a backdrop, we're going to switch to look at the capital markets and the amount of exploration dollars that have been flowing into the sector and how those dollars have been deployed over the last year and decade. And hopefully this will provide us some insight into what the next 12 to 18 months are going to look like. So the bar graph on the left here shows the equity raised over the last decade by jurisdiction, and it's been quite a roller coaster, with significant funds raised here recently in 2021 on the back of very strong commodity prices. However, in 2022, the winds have changed, as I noted earlier, and with respect to metal prices, and the pace of money invested in the sector has slowed significantly, as our industry is not immune to the impacts being felt across the broader markets. So price declines, demand uncertainty, inflation, and recessionary concerns. So on this point, investment into the sector in Canada appears to be holding up as well or better than many of the other major markets around the world, but it's still down. The wheel chart on the right-hand side of the slide shows that Canada has been the top destination for raising capital over the last 10 years, taking home 1/5 or 20% of the pie. That said, however, Australia has taken the top position from Canada in 2020 and 2021, and the trend seems to be playing out again in 2022. So we're losing ground. However, with this as the backdrop, Canada is still expected to be one of the primary sources of new capital investment for the mineral industry in 2022. And this reflects the depth of our financial service ecosystem's ability to connect investors to mineral exploration companies, and is an inherent advantage we have here in Canada. So switching focus here from international to Canadian markets and now really in Canadian dollars, this bar chart really shows the money raised on the TSX and TSX Venture Exchange over the last decade, and it's broken down by type of financing completed, whether it's private placement, public offerings, or IPO. So you can see here we've seen a healthy rebound in capital investment from all sources over the last couple of years. And in 2021, private placements hit a decade high, and public offerings and IPOs were at a level not reached since 2017-18 or 16-17. Collectively, the amount of money invested into the sector in 2021 was the most recorded since 2012, and this can really be attributed largely to the upward price trends for the metals that we looked at earlier. This can't be said for 2022. The overall markets have weakened. We've seen major indices like the S&P and Dow down as much as 20% or more at points. And this has impacted the availability of risk capital as commodity prices have largely been on a downward trend this year. On a positive note, while we may fall short of the 2021 peak, this year is projected to be at least in line with historical averages. And at the end of August here, we nearly surpassed the amount of money raised in all of 2019. And if you recall the prior graph, this really can't be said on a global basis, with 2022 expected to be near the low end of financings for the last decade globally. So just jumping on to talk a little bit about flow-through shares, and this is one of the big advantages Canada has. It enables the Canadian minerals explorers to continue to attract investment even in a weak market. Flow-through has been the source of roughly $25 billion in domestic exploration financing over the last 2 years. And in fact, 2021 represented an all-time high for the amount of funds raised via flow-through shares. And while the trajectory for 2022 is not going to reach the 2021 peak, it's shaping up to be another significant year, eclipsing $1 billion, and perhaps for only the third time since the regime's inception in the 1970s. At PDAC, we recognize the challenges junior explorers have faced in sourcing hard dollars outside of flow-through shares. And while we have little influence on the outside markets, we're very active in advocating with regulators to make financing rules less onerous on small companies, and in advocating to various extensions of the federal government that deal with and administer flow-through shares. Our aim is to see the regime steadily improved and streamlined with industry practices so that it's effectively and practical for the industry to continue to fuel new discoveries within Canada. So in recent years, PDAC has prompted government to produce flow-through share guidance tables in several iterations, and this helped provide improved clarity around applicable expenditures and helps companies stay within the boundaries of admissible types of exploration work. PDAC was the driver behind the government's one-year extension of deadlines associated with the spending of flow-through share funds for exploration work through the COVID pandemic in 2020, as well as getting the mineral exploration and tax credit extended for an additional 5 years in 2019. And our call for increased exploration incentives has also been recognized in the federal budget 2022, with government committing to a new critical minerals exploration tax credit, and this is under the flow-through share regime that's going to be available until at least 2027. And this new incentive was reaffirmed in this month's fall economic statement. It's going to double the potential tax deductions for investors to 30% relative to the METC, and should be a catalyst for increased investment in critical mineral exploration. So just a quick summary on the finance issues that we just talked about that are playing out around the industry. So there's a slowdown projected across most regions over the next 12 to 24 months. And when coupled with supply chain constraints and rampant inflation, this has been really driving broader markets downwards for the bulk of 2022. A weak near-term industrial demand outlook has acted as a headwind for commodity prices, particularly base metals. And the relative strength of the U.S. economy to others around the world has been a recent catalyst for the U.S. dollar, which may continue to hold back gold and other precious metal prices in the short term. That said, Canadian explorers continue to be supported by the flow-through share regime, which is a major source of investment capital in the sector and in the face of such broad, weak markets. So over the next couple slides, I'm just going to see how flow-through share funding has impacted exploration activity in Canada over the last decade and where those exploration dollars we've just reviewed are being spent. And I'm going to start by looking at spending on a global level and then dial it down to look at Canada specifically by region and by commodity. So the bar chart you see here on the left outlines the amount of mineral exploration dollars going into the ground in various regions around the world over roughly the last decade. And we can see that 2022 is likely to represent a relative high point since 2013, both globally and in Canada. And based on S&P's data, on average, Canada attracts more exploration dollars than any other single nation. And again, it's notable that Canada has seen roughly 1/5 or 20% of all global exploration spending over the last 2 years. And if we look at the wheel chart on the right, you can see this is a notable increase from the percentage of spend recorded in 2013, with Australia working hard to overtake us. Our top position speaks to highly competitive industry landscape and the transparent regulatory processes that have been established within Canada over many years, and the vast potential for new mineral discoveries that exist from coast to coast to coast. That said, Australia has closed the gap over the last decade, claiming top spot for mineral exploration spending in 2019 and 2020. And this should be a healthy reminder for our regulators and governments that we must work on a continuing basis to protect Canadian competitiveness and regulatory certainty to ensure that we have a vibrant mineral exploration industry for future generations to come. So just switching over to the Canadian spend, this bar chart here gives a breakdown of the amount being spent by region in Canada over the last decade. And similar to the global trend, we see Canada surpassing last year to reach a high point in 2022. Activity this year nearly equals the all-time record high point of $3.8 billion in domestic exploration spending reached in 2012, which is just off the left of this chart here. Ontario, again, is projected to be the top jurisdiction for exploration investment this year, and it is consistently a top 3 region along with Quebec and BC. These three provinces basically account for 70% of the total amount of money expected to be spent. A closer look at investment in Yukon, NRCan estimates there's going to be nearly $150 million in mineral exploration within the Yukon this year, nearly double the amount spent in 2020, which represented a 15-year low for the exploration in the territory. And this likely suggests the acute impacts of COVID-19 are behind us, and that really the flow-through funding that was raised in 2021 is being spent accordingly. It's not surprising that we see high levels of exploration activity in the market this year, given the amount of equity that were raised in the markets last year, and that peak in flow-through share issuance. As we know, the money must hit the ground within 12 to 18 months of those new shares being issued into the marketplace. And with this lag period between financing exploration in mind and what we saw in the previous slides, there's a really good chance here that we're going to see a slowdown activity in 2023 on the back of the markets cooling this year in terms of total amount of equity raised and flow-through share funds raised. So this is my final graphic here, and it's based on NRCan data, which breaks down what minerals are being targeted within Canada and how much of the exploration spend they attract. This data supports my 60-40 rule in that precious metals and gold exploration in particular attract about 60% of the spend on an annual basis. And that really creates a lot of competition for financing land in that space. The wheel chart on the right shows the average amount of money directed towards particular minerals in Canada over the last decade. And while base metal exploration has been on the rise in the last few years, the proportion going towards other metals and non-metals, things like lithium, cobalt, graphite, and rare earths, remains below 5% of the total activities. This highlights the need to expedite implementation of the incentives like the new 30% critical mineral exploration tax credit, and moving forward with the nearly $4 billion committed in the last year's federal budget to boost Canada's critical mineral supply chains. It's clear that our government's response to the PDAC and industry advocacy efforts for competitive fiscal policies and targeting incentives to go a long way to making the Canadian exploration development landscape very competitive in the global market and reducing volatility during major downturns. So I just want to close off here by sharing how excited I am here about returning to what I expect to be a normal, fully in-person convention this coming March. And normal there is a new norm, but this is, I think, really great to see happening. We're back in March. This aligns more closely with the core elements of our industry, like the market activity, providing timely place for students and new professionals and industry people that spend their time in the field to come and convene and network. So I know a lot of people like June and they love the weather in June, but we're back in March, and that's, I think, where we're going to stay. I hope to see as many of you as possible at the Convention Centre in Toronto, where we're going to be back at both the North and South buildings and really expanding our floor, and hopefully welcoming even more exhibitors this coming March. I think importantly, in addition to what you see in terms of the exhibits and extensive programming, we aim to host as many government officials as possible, and that includes MPs, federal cabinet ministers, et cetera. We're going to continue to work each day to ensure that our members have a voice in Canadian policy and that the mineral industry is going to continue to play a critical role in our transition to a low-carbon future. So with that, thank you very much for your attention, and thank you for inviting me to speak here today.